Captain Sarah Martinez gripped the edge of her tank's hatch as the desert wind whipped sand across her face. The morning sun cast long shadows across the training grounds of Fort Irwin, California, where her M1A2 Abrams tank sat motionless among a formation of other armored vehicles. Today was supposed to be routine training, but nothing about this day would prove ordinary. Sarah had grown up listening to her grandfather's stories about tank warfare in Vietnam. Sergeant Major Roberto Martinez had served 3 tours, commanding an M48 Patton tank through some of the fiercest battles of the war. While other children played with dolls or video games, Sarah sat captivated by his tales of mechanical breakdowns, communication failures, and the ingenuity required to survive when technology failed. Mija, he would say, using the Spanish term of endearment. Tanks are just metal boxes with big guns. But the heart of any tank crew is here. He would tap his temple. And here, he would place his hand over his heart. When all your fancy gadgets stop working, you fall back on training, instinct, and teamwork. Those words seemed distant now as Sarah commanded Bravo Company's lead tank in what was meant to be a complex combined arms exercise. Her crew consisted of 3 other soldiers, Staff Sergeant Mike Chen, her gunner, and second-in-command, Specialist Jessica Rodriguez, the loader, and Private First Class Tommy Walsh, the driver. They had trained together for 8 months, developing the kind of trust that only comes from countless hours of working in the cramped confines of their steel home. The B exercise scenario involved coordinating with infantry units to clear a simulated enemy stronghold. Sarah's company of 4 tanks would provide heavy fire support, while foot soldiers advanced through a series of concrete bunkers and obstacles designed to mimic real combat conditions. Everything depended on precise communication between units, and the sophisticated computer systems that managed targeting, navigation, and tactical coordination. At exactly 0800 hours, Sarah received the radio call to begin the advance. "Thunder 6, this is Thunder 11 moving to position Alpha," she transmitted, using the call signs assigned for the exercise. Her tank lurched forward as Walsh engaged the transmission, the massive turbine engine roaring to life with its distinctive whine. The first few miles proceeded without incident. Sarah's tank led the formation across the desert terrain, following GPS coordinates displayed on her digital map system. The computer constantly updated their position, marked friendly and simulated enemy locations, and provided real-time intelligence about the battlefield. Modern tank warfare relied heavily on these information systems to maintain situational awareness and coordinate complex maneuvers. Chen monitored the thermal imaging system, scanning for heat signatures that might indicate enemy positions. The B high-tech sensors could detect a human body from over 2 miles away, even in complete darkness. Rodriguez kept the main gun loaded and ready, while Walsh navigated using both visual references and the tank's advanced positioning system. Everything changed in an instant. Sarah first noticed something was wrong when her radio crackled with static instead of clear communications. The digital display that showed her position flickered once, twice, then went completely black. A moment later, the thermal imaging system shut down, followed by the fire control computer. "Sir, we're losing systems," Chen reported, his voice tight with concern. "Thermal's down, fire control is offline, and I'm getting error messages across the board." Sarah felt her stomach drop as she realized the extent of the problem. Without their electronic systems, they were essentially blind. The GPS was dead, the radio produced only static, and the sophisticated targeting computer that normally calculated range, wind, and ballistic trajectories had simply stopped working. "Walsh, halt the tank," Sarah ordered. She grabbed her binoculars and climbed higher in her hatch to survey the situation. Looking back, she could see that the other tanks in her formation had also stopped. Without radio communication, she had no way to coordinate with them or receive orders from higher command. The training exercise was supposed to continue for another 6 hours. Somewhere ahead lay the objective they were meant to capture, defended by opposing forces equipped with anti-tank weapons and supported by their own armored vehicles. Behind her, friendly infantry units were counting on her tanks to provide covering fire and breakthrough capability. Sarah's mind raced through possible solutions. The technical manuals called for specific procedures when systems failed. But those Procedures assumed some equipment would still be functioning. Total system failure like this was considered so unlikely that there were no standard protocols for dealing with it. That's when her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory. During one of his stories about Vietnam, he had described a similar situation. His tank had taken a hit that knocked out all electrical systems during a critical battle near Cu Chi. With no radio, no instruments, and enemy forces closing in, Sergeant Martinez had to rely on basic tactics and visual communication to complete his mission. When your technology fails you, he had told young Sarah, you go back to the fundamentals. You use your eyes, your brain, and your crew. Tanks fought battles for decades before computers existed. Sarah made a decision that would define her career and inspire a new generation of tank commanders. Instead of waiting for repairs or calling off the exercise, she would adapt her grandfather's Vietnam-era tactics to modern warfare. She would prove that skilled crews could still fight effectively even when their advanced systems failed. She climbed down into the tank and addressed her crew. Listen up, everyone. We're going to continue this mission using old-school methods. Chen, forget about the thermal sights. You're going to spot targets using the optical scope, just like tank gunners did for 50 years before thermal imaging existed. Rodriguez will calculate ammunition types and loads manually. Walsh, navigation is going to be by map and compass. The crew looked uncertain, but they trusted their commander. Sarah had trained them well, and they knew she had grown up immersed in tank warfare history and tactics. If anyone could pull off fighting a modern battle with World War II methods, it was Captain Martinez. Sarah pulled out a paper topographic map and spread it across her lap. Using a compass and landmarks visible through her periscope, she began plotting their current position and the route to their objective. It was slow, methodical work that required patience and skill, but it was exactly what tank commanders had done for generations before GPS existed. The silence inside the tank felt deafening without the constant hum of electronic systems. Sarah spread her grandfather's old Vietnam War field manual across her knees, its pages yellowed and worn from decades of use. She had carried it with her throughout her military career, treating it like a talisman that connected her to the generations of tank crews who had fought before her. Walsh, I need you to drive using only visual references, Sarah instructed, pointing to terrain features marked on her paper map. See that ridgeline at 2 o'clock? We're going to use that as our guide. Stay about 500 meters to the left of it. Private Walsh nodded nervously. He had trained extensively with GPS navigation, but dead reckoning was something older drivers talked about like ancient history. Without the digital compass and positioning system, he would have to rely on the sun's position, terrain features, and basic orienteering skills that many modern soldiers had never needed to develop. Sarah climbed back up to her commander's position and used hand signals to communicate with the other tank commanders in her formation. The basic military hand signals were still taught, but rarely used in an era of instant digital communication. She pointed forward, held up 4 fingers to indicate the formation pattern, and gestured toward their objective area. The other commanders seemed confused at first but quickly understood the situation. Tank warfare had always included contingency plans for communication failures, though few crews had ever needed to implement them. Sarah watched as each commander acknowledged her signals and began organizing their own crews for manual operations. Chen was struggling with the optical sighting system, equipment that was still present in modern tanks but rarely used. Captain, this is like trying to thread a needle compared to thermal imaging, he complained. I can see maybe half the distance, and I have to actually track movement with my eyes instead of letting the computer do it. That's exactly how your grandfather's generation did it, Sarah replied. They didn't have computer assistance, but they still won battles. The key is patience and observation. Watch for movement patterns, dust clouds, and anything that doesn't belong in the natural landscape. Rodriguez was calculating ammunition loads using a slide rule she had found in the tank's emergency kit. Modern tanks carried sophisticated ballistic computers that could instantly calculate the optimal shell type and charge for any target at any range. Without those systems, she had to manually determine whether to use armor-piercing rounds, high-explosive shells, or specialized munitions based on estimated distance and target type. This is actually kind of cool, Rodriguez admitted, working through the mathematical calculations. I feel like I'm really understanding how the physics works, instead of just trusting a computer to figure it out for me. As the formation began, moving again, Sarah realized how much modern tank crews had come to depend on technology. Her grandfather's generation had developed an intuitive understanding of their vehicles and weapons that seemed almost superhuman. They could estimate ranges by eye, predict wind effects on projectiles, and coordinate complex maneuvers using nothing more than radio voice commands and visual signals. The first test came when they crested a hill and spotted the enemy position ahead. Through her binoculars, Sarah could see 3 simulated enemy tanks positioned among a cluster of buildings about 2,000 meters away. In normal circumstances, her fire control system would have immediately calculated exact ranges, identified target, priorities, and recommended engagement tactics. Instead, Sarah had to make these decisions using decades-old methods. She studied the terrain between her position and the enemy, looking for obstacles that might affect her shots and cover that could protect her own tanks during the engagement. She estimated the range using a technique her grandfather had taught her, holding up her thumb at arm's length and comparing it to known dimensions of the target vehicles. Chen, enemy armor, 11 o'clock, approximately 2,100 meters, Sarah called out. 3 targets, hull-down position behind the building complex. Chen struggled to acquire the targets through his optical scope. Without thermal imaging, the enemy tanks blended into the background, visible only when they moved or when the angle of sunlight reflected off their armor. It took him nearly 2 minutes to locate what the thermal system would have identified in seconds. "Contact, I have eyes on target," Chen finally reported. "Which one do you want me to engage first?" Sarah analyzed the tactical situation the way her grandfather had taught her. The leftmost enemy tank had the best field of fire against her formation, making it the highest priority target. The center tank appeared to be in a better defensive position, while the rightmost tank seemed to be moving into an attack position. "Left target first," Sarah decided. "Use armor piercing and remember to lead the target if it's moving." This was where the old-school methods became most challenging. Modern fire control systems automatically compensated for target movement, tank movement, wind effects, and dozens of other variables that affected projectile flight. Chen would have to calculate these factors mentally and adjust his aim accordingly. The first shot missed by about 50 meters, kicking up a cloud of dust behind the target. In a real battle, that miss could have been fatal, but this was training. And Sarah knew her crew was learning invaluable skills that could save their lives in future combat. "Too far left, drop 100 meters, Sarah coached. "The target is stationary, so hold steady on your aim point." Chen's second shot was much closer, and his third round scored a direct hit. The exercise controllers confirmed the kill over the emergency radio frequency they had switched to when their primary systems failed, but the engagement had taken nearly 10 minutes instead of the 2 or 3 minutes it would have required with modern systems. Sarah realized that fighting this way required not just different techniques, but a completely different mindset about time and patience. As her formation continued toward the objective, Sarah began to understand something profound about the evolution of armored warfare. Each technological advancement had made tank crews more capable, but also more dependent on that technology. Her grandfather's generation had possessed a depth of tactical knowledge and mechanical understanding that modern crews often lacked. The radio crackled with a transmission from the exercise controllers. "Thunder 1-1, this is Control. Are you experiencing technical difficulties? Your advance has been slower than expected." Sarah keyed her microphone. "Control, Thunder 1-1. We are continuing the mission using alternate procedures. No assistance required at this time." She wasn't about to admit that their systems had failed. This was an opportunity to prove that well-trained crews could adapt to equipment failures and still complete their mission. It was also a chance to honor her grandfather's memory by demonstrating that his hard-earned knowledge still had value in modern warfare. The afternoon sun blazed overhead as Sarah's formation approached the main objective, a fortified compound that the enemy was defending with determination. Sweat dripped down her face as she studied the tactical situation through her binoculars, trying to see the battlefield the way her grandfather would have seen it 60 years earlier, in the jungles of Vietnam. Without digital intelligence feeds, satellite imagery, or drone reconnaissance, Sarah had to gather information the old-fashioned way. She observed enemy movement patterns, noted the positions of defensive fortifications, and tried to identify weak points in their lines. It was slow, methodical work that required patience and experience that most modern commanders never developed. "Chen, what do you see through the main gun sight?" Sarah asked, wanting her gunner's perspective on the tactical situation. "I count at least 6 defensive positions, probably more hidden behind those concrete barriers," Chen reported. "There's definitely movement in the trenches, but without thermal imaging, I can't get accurate counts on personnel." Sarah nodded, remembering her grandfather's stories about the fog of war and the importance of making decisions with incomplete information. Modern commanders had become accustomed to having detailed, real-time intelligence about enemy positions, but earlier generations had learned to fight effectively, despite uncertainty. The plan Sarah developed was based on tactics her grandfather had used during the siege of Fire Support Base Charlie in 1968. Instead of relying on precision strikes guided by computer systems, she would use suppressive fire and maneuver warfare to overwhelm the enemy defenses. "Rodriguez, load high explosive," Sarah ordered. "We're going to lay down covering fire while the other tanks move to flanking positions." Using hand signals, Sarah coordinated with the other tank commanders in her formation. Without digital communication systems, every maneuver had to be planned and executed using visual signals and predetermined tactical procedures. It was like conducting an orchestra where the musicians could only see the conductor's hands. The attack began with Sarah's tank providing suppressive fire against the enemy positions. Chen aimed for areas where he had observed movement, trying to keep the defenders pinned down while the other tanks maneuvered. Without computer-assisted targeting, each shot required careful calculation of range, elevation, and wind effects. "Fire!" Sarah commanded. The main gun roared, sending a high-explosive round downrange. The shell impacted near one of the defensive positions, showering the area with fragments and debris. It wasn't as precise as computer-guided munitions, but it was effective at suppressing enemy activity. Walsh drove the tank in a serpentine pattern, following routes that Sarah had plotted on her paper map to avoid known enemy positions. Without GPS navigation, he had to rely on terrain recognition and compass headings, skills that many modern drivers had never fully developed. The most challenging aspect was coordinating with the infantry units that were supposed to advance alongside the tanks. Without digital communication systems, Sarah had to use radio procedures that were decades old, combined with visual signals and prearranged coordination points. "Red Dog 6, this is Thunder 1-1. Sarah transmitted over the backup radio frequency. "We are beginning our approach to phase line Alpha. Request you begin your advance on my signal." The infantry commander's response was barely audible through the static. "Thunder 1-1, Red Dog 6. Roger, standing by for your signal." Sarah watched as enemy fire began concentrating on her position. Without the electronic warfare systems that normally detected and jammed enemy communications, the opposing forces were able to coordinate their defensive fires more effectively than expected. Several rockets streaked past her tank, leaving trails of smoke in the desert air. "Incoming!" Walsh shouted as an anti-tank missile exploded against a concrete barrier near their position. The explosion reminded Sarah of her grandfather's stories about facing enemy fire without the protective systems that modern tanks carried. His generation had relied on armor thickness, tactical movement, and crew skill to survive in combat. They hadn't had reactive armor, electronic countermeasures, or computer-controlled defensive systems. Chen acquired another target, a simulated anti-tank position that was directing fire at the advancing infantry. "Target acquired, ready to fire. Send it," Sarah replied. The high-explosive round found its mark, eliminating the threat and allowing the infantry to continue their advance. But the engagement had required nearly 5 minutes of careful observation and manual target tracking, time that modern fire control systems would have reduced to seconds. As the battle continued, Sarah began to notice something unexpected happening with her crew. Without the constant information feeds from digital systems, they were developing a heightened awareness of their surroundings. Chen was becoming more skilled at spotting targets through optical sights. Rodriguez was gaining intuitive understanding of ammunition effects, and Walsh was reading terrain like a map. "Captain, I'm actually starting to prefer this," Rodriguez admitted during a brief lull in the fighting. "When the computer calculates everything for you, you don't really understand what's happening. This way, I feel like I'm really part of the battle," Sarah smiled, remembering similar comments from her grandfather about the satisfaction of mastering complex skills rather than depending on automation. There was something deeply human about the process of learning, adapting, and overcoming challenges through personal skill rather than technological assistance. The turning point came when Sarah spotted an opportunity that computer systems might have missed. While analyzing the enemy positions through her binoculars, she noticed that the defenders had concentrated their forces to counter the frontal assault, leaving their flanks relatively unprotected. Her grandfather had always emphasized the importance of human intuition in warfare, the ability to see patterns and opportunities that might not be obvious to automated systems. Sarah developed a plan to exploit the enemy's tactical error, but it would require precise coordination between all elements of her force. Using a combination of hand signals and radio communications, Sarah directed 2 of her tanks to maintain pressure on the enemy front, while she led a flanking maneuver around their left side. It was a classic armored warfare tactic that had been used successfully for decades before digital battlefield management systems existed. The maneuver required careful timing and navigation without GPS assistance. Sarah used terrain features, compass headings, and dead reckoning to guide her tank around the enemy flank, staying hidden behind ridgelines and rock formations that provided concealment from enemy observation. "Walsh, bring us up slowly behind that hill," Sarah directed. "We want to come over the crest at exactly the right angle to catch them in their exposed positions." As her tank crested the hill, Sarah found herself looking down at the enemy's flank positions from less than 800 meters away. The defenders were focused on the frontal assault and had not posted adequate security on their flanks, exactly as she had hoped. The moment of truth arrived as Sarah's tank emerged from behind the ridge, presenting a perfect flanking shot against the enemy positions. Through her commander's sight, she could see enemy soldiers scrambling to reposition their weapons to meet this unexpected threat from their left side. Their confusion and panic were exactly what her grandfather had described when his unit had successfully flanked North Vietnamese positions near the Cambodian border. "Chen, multiple targets 9 o'clock to 11 o'clock, Sarah called out calmly. "Start with the heavy weapons positions and work your way through the infantry." Without computer-assisted target prioritization, Chen had to make split-second decisions about which targets posed the greatest threat. He could see an enemy anti-tank team trying to swing their weapon toward Sarah's position, while machine gunners were attempting to establish fields of fire against the flanking attack. "Engaging heavy weapons first," Chen confirmed, adjusting his optical sight manually. The crosshairs settled on the anti-tank position just as the enemy crew finished traversing their weapon toward Sarah's tank. The main gun fired, and the high explosive round eliminated the anti-tank threat in a cloud of smoke and debris. Rodriguez immediately began loading another round while Chen searched for his next target through the optical sight. "Good hit. Next target, machine gun position in the trench at 10 o'clock, Sarah directed. The second shot scattered the machine, gun crew, and suppressed enemy fire from that section of the defensive line. Without thermal imaging to see through the smoke and dust, Chen had to wait for the air to clear before identifying additional targets. But the psychological effect of the flanking attack was already disrupting the entire enemy defense. Sarah coordinated the assault using the same tactical radio procedures her grandfather had learned in Vietnam. "Red Dog 6, Thunder 1-1, enemy flank is broken. Begin your assault on the main positions now," the infantry commander responded immediately. "Thunder 1-1, Red Dog 6. Roger, we are advancing. Thanks for the opening." Sarah watched through her binoculars as friendly infantry soldiers emerged from their covered positions and began advancing across the open ground toward the enemy trenches. Without digital coordination systems, the timing had to be perfect to prevent friendly fire incidents, but the manual coordination was working exactly as planned. The remaining tanks in Sarah's formation pressed their frontal assault while she maintained pressure on the enemy flank. It was a classic hammer and anvil tactic that had been used successfully in armored warfare since World War II, but executing it without modern communication and navigation systems required skills that few contemporary tank crews possessed. "Walsh, advance slowly toward those bunkers at 2 o'clock, Sarah ordered. "Keep us positioned so Chen has clear shots at any targets that present themselves." Walsh maneuvered the tank with growing confidence, reading the terrain and understanding how their position affected both offensive capabilities and defensive protection. Without GPS guidance, he had developed an intuitive feel for the tank's relationship to the surrounding landscape. Enemy resistance began to collapse as the coordinated assault overwhelmed their defensive positions. The exercise controllers began, calling out casualties and equipment losses as the simulated battle reached its conclusion. Sarah's unconventional tactics had achieved the training objectives despite the complete failure of their electronic systems. Ceasefire, this is Control," the radio announced. "Exercise complete. All units hold positions for after-action review." As the dust settled and the noise of battle faded, Sarah felt a profound sense of accomplishment. Her crew had successfully completed a complex combined arms mission using tactics and techniques that predated modern military technology by decades. They had proven that skilled soldiers could adapt to equipment failures and still accomplish their mission. Colonel James Patterson, the exercise commander, arrived at Sarah's position within 30 minutes. His helicopter kicked up clouds of desert sand as it landed nearby, and Sarah climbed down from her tank to meet him. She expected to face questions about the equipment failures and the unconventional methods her unit had employed. "Captain Martinez," Colonel Patterson began, "I need to understand what happened out there. Your formation showed significant deviations from standard operating procedures, but the results were actually better than we typically see in these exercises." Sarah took a deep breath and explained the complete system failure that had affected her tank and the decision to continue the mission using Vietnam-era tactics learned from her grandfather. She described the manual navigation, optical targeting, and radio procedures that had enabled her crew to adapt to the equipment failure. Colonel Patterson listened intently, occasionally asking questions about specific techniques or procedures. Rather than criticism, Sarah detected genuine interest and even admiration in his voice. "Captain, what you accomplished today was remarkable," the colonel said finally. "Modern tank crews have become so dependent on electronic systems that most would be helpless if those systems failed in actual combat. You've demonstrated that properly trained crews can still fight effectively using fundamental skills." Sarah felt a surge of pride, not just for herself but for her grandfather's legacy. The old sergeant's knowledge and experience had proven relevant and valuable even in the era of digital warfare. "Sir, my grandfather always said that technology should enhance human capabilities, not replace them," Sarah replied. "Today proved that the basic skills of armored warfare are still essential, even with all our modern advantages." The colonel nodded thoughtfully. "Captain, I want you to develop a training program based on what you learned today. We need to ensure that all our tank crews can operate effectively even when their electronic systems fail. This could be crucial in combat against enemies who use electronic warfare or cyber attacks." As Colonel Patterson departed, Sarah looked back at her tank crew, who were cleaning and maintaining their equipment with the satisfaction of soldiers who had met a difficult challenge. Chen was carefully adjusting the optical sights. Rodriguez was organizing ammunition according to manual calculations she had developed, and Walsh was studying the paper maps they had used for navigation. "Hey, Captain," Chen called out. "When do we start training other crews in these techniques? This was actually pretty awesome once I got the hang of it." Sarah smiled, knowing that her grandfather would have been proud of the day's accomplishments. The old sergeant's Vietnam War experiences had found new relevance in modern warfare, proving that the fundamental principles of armored combat remained constant even as technology evolved. The sun was setting over the desert training grounds, casting long shadows across the battlefield where Sarah's crew had proven that human skill, determination, and traditional military knowledge could overcome technological failures and still achieve victory. 3 weeks after the training exercise, Sarah found herself standing in front of a classroom filled with tank commanders from across the division. Word had spread quickly through military channels about the crew that had successfully completed A complex mission using Vietnam-era tactics when their modern systems failed. What had started as an equipment malfunction had evolved into a revolutionary approach to military training. The key principle my grandfather taught me, Sarah explained to the assembled officers, is that technology should be a tool that enhances human capabilities, not a crutch that replaces fundamental skills. When those tools fail, and they will fail, you need to fall back on basic knowledge and training. She had spent the past 3 weeks working with Colonel Patterson and the division training staff to develop a comprehensive program that would teach modern tank crews the skills their predecessors had mastered decades earlier. The program would be called Legacy Skills Training, combining traditional armored warfare techniques with contemporary tactical doctrine. Major Thompson, a veteran commander with 15 years of experience, raised his hand. Captain Martinez, with all due respect, why should we train our crews in obsolete techniques when our equipment rarely fails? Isn't this a waste of valuable training time? Sarah had expected this question and had prepared a detailed response based on intelligence reports and combat experiences from recent conflicts. Sir, enemy forces are increasingly using electronic warfare, cyber attacks, and electromagnetic pulse weapons specifically designed to disable our advanced systems. In Syria, 3 of our tanks were temporarily disabled by electronic warfare attacks. In Eastern Europe, cyber intrusions have affected vehicle systems during training exercises. She clicked to the next slide in her presentation, showing photographs of damaged electronic equipment from various combat zones. More importantly, crew members who understand the fundamental principles of gunnery, navigation, and communication become better operators even when their systems are working normally. They can troubleshoot problems, adapt to unexpected situations, and make decisions based on tactical understanding rather than just following computer prompts. The skepticism in the room began to shift toward genuine interest as Sarah described the specific techniques her crew had used during the exercise. She explained dead reckoning navigation using compass and map, manual range estimation using optical methods, and ballistic calculation using slide rules and mathematical formulas. Sergeant First Class Williams, an experienced gunner, leaned forward in his seat. "Ma'am, I've been operating tank weapon systems for 12 years, and I've never had to calculate trajectory manually. How long does it take to learn these methods?" "The basic skills can be learned in about 2 weeks of intensive training," Sarah replied. "Mastering them takes months of practice, but even basic proficiency can make the difference between mission success and failure when electronic systems are compromised." Sarah had brought her grandfather's field manual and several pieces of vintage military equipment to demonstrate the techniques. She showed the class how to use a military compass for navigation, how to calculate range using the MIL-DOT system in optical sights, and how to determine ammunition requirements using manual calculations. "Watch this," Sarah said, pulling out a slide rule that had belonged to her grandfather. Before ballistic computers, tank gunners used these to calculate firing solutions. You input the estimated range, target speed, wind conditions, and ammunition type, then read the elevation and lead angles directly from the scales. The demonstration fascinated the younger officers, many of whom had never seen mechanical calculation devices. Sarah worked through several examples, showing how gunners could quickly generate accurate firing solutions without any electronic assistance. Captain Davis, a company commander with extensive combat experience, spoke up. "This is actually similar to what we do in forward observation. When our digital systems go down, we fall back on map and compass methods that artillery observers have used for generations. The principles are the same." Sarah nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly right, sir. Every military specialty has these foundational skills that remain relevant regardless of technological advances. Tank crews just haven't maintained them because modern systems are so reliable and effective." The training program Sarah developed included several phases. First, crews would learn basic map and compass navigation without GPS assistance. Second, they would practice optical target acquisition and manual range estimation. Third, they would master manual ballistic calculations and ammunition selection. Finally, they would conduct live-fire exercises using only traditional methods. The goal isn't to replace modern systems, Sarah emphasized. It's to ensure that crews can continue operating effectively when those systems are unavailable. Think of it as military insurance policy. Colonel Patterson entered the classroom as Sarah was concluding her presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, I've received approval from Division Headquarters to implement Captain Martinez's training program across all armored units. This will become mandatory training for all tank crews, and successful completion will be required for promotion to senior enlisted ranks. The announcement generated considerable discussion among the assembled commanders. Some expressed concern about the additional training requirements, while others were excited about the opportunity to learn traditional military skills that had been largely forgotten. Sir, what about resistance from crews who think this training is unnecessary? Asked Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, a battalion commander. Colonel Patterson smiled. Captain Martinez's crew will serve as instructors and demonstrate the effectiveness of these techniques. Once other crews see what's possible, I think you'll find enthusiasm rather than resistance. After the formal presentation, several officers approached Sarah with questions about specific techniques and training methods. Many were genuinely interested in learning skills that their fathers or grandfathers had used in earlier conflicts. Captain Johnson, a young officer who had recently taken command of his first tank company, was particularly eager to participate. Ma'am, my grandfather served in Korea with the 1st Cavalry Division. He always told me that modern soldiers were losing touch with the fundamentals of warfare. I think he would have loved this program. Sarah felt a deep connection to these comments, remembering her own grandfather's concerns about over-reliance on technology. Sergeant Major Martinez had often worried that future generations of soldiers would be helpless if their sophisticated equipment failed at critical moments. Your grandfather was right, Sarah replied. Every generation of military equipment has been more advanced than the previous one, but the basic principles of tactics, leadership, and soldier skills remain constant. This training helps crews understand those principles. As the meeting concluded, Sarah reflected on how quickly her emergency adaptation had evolved into a formal training program. What had started as a desperate attempt to complete a mission despite equipment failure had become a model for preparing modern military units to operate in degraded electronic environments. The legacy of her grandfather's Vietnam experience was now being passed on to a new generation of tank crews who would carry these skills into future conflicts. Sarah knew that Sergeant Major Martinez would have been proud to see his hard-earned knowledge helping soldiers more than 50 years after. He had learned it in the jungles of Southeast Asia. 6 months later, Sarah stood on the reviewing stand at Fort Knox, watching as tank crews from across the Army demonstrated the traditional skills that had once seemed obsolete. The Legacy Skills Training Program had exceeded everyone's expectations, producing crews who were not only more capable when systems failed, but also more effective when all their equipment was functioning normally. The demonstration included navigation courses, where crews used only map and compass, gunnery competitions using optical sights instead of thermal imaging, and communication exercises relying on radio procedures from the 1960s. The results were impressive, with crews achieving accuracy and coordination levels that surprised even experienced instructors. General Patricia Hayes, the commanding general of Army Armor School, addressed the assembled crowd. What we're witnessing today represents a fundamental shift in how we prepare our armored forces for future conflicts. Captain Martinez's program has shown us that combining traditional military skills with modern technology produces more capable and adaptable soldiers. Sarah's grandfather had passed away 2 months earlier, but not before seeing the widespread adoption of his Vietnam-era knowledge by contemporary tank crews. In his final weeks, Sergeant Major Martinez had visited several training sessions, sharing stories and techniques with young soldiers who were eager to learn from his experience. Mija, he had told Sarah during one of their last conversations, I never thought my old war stories would help modern soldiers, but maybe that's how knowledge really works. Each generation builds on what came before, keeping the best parts and adding new ideas. The program had attracted attention from military leaders around the world. NATO allies had sent observers to study the training methods, and several countries had requested assistance in developing similar programs for their own armored forces. What had started as an emergency adaptation during a single training exercise had become a model for military education globally. Staff Sergeant Chen, now promoted and serving as a senior instructor in the program, approached Sarah after the demonstration. "Captain, remember that first day when our systems failed? I thought we were done for. Now I can't imagine operating a tank without understanding these fundamentals." Sarah smiled, watching as young tank crews practiced the same techniques her grandfather had used in Vietnam. The circle was complete in a way she had never anticipated. "Chen, my grandfather used to say that every challenge is an opportunity to learn something new. That equipment failure taught us more about tank warfare than years of normal training." The success of the program had led to Sarah's promotion to major in assignment as the Chief of Armored Warfare Doctrine at Fort Knox. Her responsibility now was to ensure that traditional military skills remained part of modern training, preventing future generations from losing the hard-earned knowledge of their predecessors. During the demonstration, a young private named Johnson approached Sarah with questions about manual gunnery techniques. His enthusiasm reminded her of herself as a child listening to her grandfather's stories about tank battles in distant lands. "Ma'am, my great-grandfather served in World War II with the 3rd Armored Division," Johnson said. "He always talked about how tank crews had to know everything about their vehicles, not just how to push buttons. This training makes me feel connected to that history." Sarah nodded, understanding the deeper significance of what they were accomplishing. "Private, you're carrying forward a tradition that goes back to the first tank crews in World War I. Every generation of tank soldiers has faced the same fundamental challenges: finding and engaging targets, navigating difficult terrain, and working as a cohesive crew under pressure." The afternoon concluded with a live fire exercise where crews demonstrated their ability to engage targets using only optical sights and manual calculations. The accuracy was remarkable, with several crews achieving scores that matched or exceeded computer-assisted gunnery results. Colonel Patterson, now promoted to Brigadier General, joined Sarah as they watched the final exercise. "Major Martinez, this program has fundamentally changed how we think about military training. You've proven that understanding principles is more important than memorizing procedures." Sarah felt a deep sense of satisfaction as she watched the crews working with the same focused intensity her grandfather had described from his combat experiences. The young soldiers were learning not just techniques, but a mindset that emphasized adaptability, problem-solving, and teamwork over dependence on technology. The program had also produced unexpected benefits in maintenance and troubleshooting. Crews who understood the mechanical and physical principles behind their equipment were better able to diagnose problems and perform field repairs. They developed an intuitive understanding of how their tanks operated that made them more effective in all aspects of armored warfare. As the sun set over the training grounds, Sarah thought about the conversation she had planned to have with her grandfather before his death. She had wanted to tell him how his stories had inspired not just her career, but a transformation in military training that would benefit soldiers for generations to come. The Legacy Skills Training Program was now being expanded to include other military specialties. Artillery crews were learning manual firing computations, infantry units were practicing land navigation without GPS, and pilots were mastering visual flight techniques that predated electronic navigation systems. "You know," Sarah said to General Patterson, "my grandfather always believed that each generation of soldiers stands on the shoulders of those who came before. This program proves that his generation's knowledge is still valuable, even in an age of artificial intelligence and autonomous weapons." The general nodded thoughtfully. "Major, you've created something more important than a training program. You've built a bridge between military generations, ensuring that hard-earned knowledge doesn't disappear when technology advances." As the participants departed, Sarah remained on the reviewing stand, watching the last rays of sunlight reflect off the armor of the tanks returning to their motor pool. Somewhere in the distance, she could almost hear her grandfather's voice telling stories about tank battles in a faraway war, stories that had seemed like ancient history, but had proven surprisingly relevant to modern warfare. The equipment failure, that had threatened to ruin a routine training exercise had instead become the foundation for a revolutionary approach to military education. Sarah had learned that the most advanced technology was only as good as the soldiers who operated it, and that the fundamental skills of warfare remained constant regardless of technological progress. Her grandfather's legacy lived on in every crew that learned to navigate by compass, calculate firing solutions manually, and coordinate attacks using voice radio procedures. The old sergeant's Vietnam War experiences had found new life in preparing contemporary soldiers for the challenges of future conflicts, proving that knowledge and experience never truly become obsolete.